Okay, you guys, so we know a lot about water at this point in the unit. We know how water works. We know the properties of water. We know how water dissolves things and how water interacts with different salts and different compounds. And the earth has a very cool and interesting cycle that it uses to recycle all the water that we have. So all the water that has been on Earth has been there since the beginning of Earth. It's the same water that the dinosaurs used. It's the same water that every animal has used throughout history, that all the trees have used, that has rained down for millions and millions and millions of years. That water just keeps getting cleaned and reused. So the process that keeps that recycling going is called the water cycle. It's a pretty simple process. It has only 3 steps in it, and between those 3 steps and some other filtration processes, the earth is able to keep that water clean and keep reusing it over and over again. We have to be careful of this because some of the interactions that we have with water can permanently pollute the water, make it so that the earth can't clean it and we can't clean it. And when we do that, that water becomes useless to us. And we have a very limited amount of water, as we talked about earlier in the unit. So we have to make sure that we aren't permanently altering the water and therefore the water cycle. So how does this water cycle work? Well, you have a square in your notes, and we're going to kind of work our way around the square. So start in the bottom right hand corner, and it helps to draw pictures with this. So we're going to start out as liquid water. Okay, the water's in our oceans, it's in our lakes, it's in our rivers. Liquid water on the surface of the earth. Okay, well, what happens to that water is that water gets warmed up a little bit, and molecules escape from the surface of the water. They turn to water vapor. Okay, and when they turn to water vapor, we call that evaporation. Evaporation is when liquid water turns to water vapor. You should write that down, but don't write it right here because we're actually going to continue our cycle around here. So take this evaporation definition and maybe write it over here on the side of your page. Okay, so you know what evaporation means. You will need to know that for your quiz and for your test. Okay, so we take that liquid water, we turn it to water vapor, and that water vapor then has less density and starts to rise in our atmosphere. Okay. Once that water vapor gets up high enough, if you can think back to first trimester, the higher you go in our atmosphere, what happens to the temperature? Yeah, it gets colder up there. So that liquid, or I'm sorry, not liquid, the water vapor rises up, and pretty soon it's going to hit that cold air. Well, what happens when gas gets cooled down? Well, it turns back into water. Okay, so we take that gas, we cool it down, and we call that condensation. Okay, condensation is when the water vapor cools down and forms really small water droplets. And again, don't write this definition right here. Maybe write it up here in the corner so it's out of the way. But when we have condensation happen, when that water vapor turns back into water droplets, clouds are formed. Okay, so that's where all of the clouds come from. The more condensation happening up there, the more clouds you're going to see. Okay, but you're not going to have any condensation if you don't have evaporation. Okay, so that's why a lot of times over deserts and stuff, you have clear blue skies, because is there liquid water to evaporate? Not a lot of water on the surface to evaporate and therefore condense into clouds. So a lot of times you'll see that. Okay, once we have it recondensed into clouds, eventually those clouds are going to get more full and more full and more full until they are chock full of water droplets. The darker the cloud is, the more water droplets are in that cloud. Eventually, that cloud cannot keep holding all that water, and the water starts to fall back to the earth. When that water falls back to earth, we call that precipitation. Okay, precipitation would be rain, snow, sleet, hail, any form of water, frozen or not frozen, that is falling back to the surface of the earth. And with that, you get the water back to the surface of the earth. Now you're here, that water runs into our oceans, our lakes, our rivers, and the process starts over again. Okay, and that water just keeps going through over and over and over again. Okay. Here's a little bit more detailed picture of the water cycle, because there are some other processes in here that help clean the water. So Again, we start here with water in our ocean. That water warms up, turns into vapor, evaporates, comes up here, gets a little cooler, it's colder up higher in the atmosphere, recondenses, we get clouds. Okay, and that's where water is stored in our atmosphere. Eventually you get too much water for the clouds to hold, and it will precipitate back down to earth. Now when it hits the ground, some of it's going to seep into underground, some of it will run through the surface back into springs and lakes and rivers, and throughout these processes that happen when it hits the ground again, a lot of those where when you run water through sand, you can clean out some of the debris. So there's some filtration processes that happen here that help clean that water as well, and we'll learn more about that later on. So the water that's going through the water cycle, we want to know a little bit about where that comes from, because that's really important. So if we look at all the water on Earth, okay, we look at all the water, 97.2% of the water on Earth is found in the oceans, or is ocean water, salt water. Okay, fresh water only accounts for 2.8% of the water. So although we're known as like the blue planet, we have lots of water, we have a very small amount of fresh water available to us. We have to be careful with that fresh water. Okay, we can then take that fresh water and let's look at that a little bit closer, because that's the water that's really important to us. That's the water that we can drink and we can use. Okay, a tiny, teeny, tiny little bit, 1/10,000% of water is found in our rivers. Okay, 1/1000% is water that's found in the atmosphere, so clouds, evaporated water. 9/1000% is in our lakes, and a little over 0.5% is in the ground. It's underwater or underground. Underwater reservoirs and underwater springs. And most of our fresh water, you'll notice here, 2.1% of that 2.8 is actually frozen in glaciers and ice caps. The reason why I want to point this out is that we don't really have access to that water. So although we have 2.8% fresh water on Earth, the stuff that we're able to use is only this. The top ones, and that only accounts for about 0.7% of the water on Earth. So we have to take really good care of that water. So most water on Earth is salt water. Of the fresh water, most of that water is stuck in our ice caps and our glaciers. So that's really important to remember. Okay? With that concludes our water cycle notes. If you have any questions, make sure you ask.